Okay, so essentially, like the main kind of round that we're going to be talking about today are rights rounds. So, first off, I guess the first question is like, what is a rights round? So, generally, a rights round is any round where concepts of freedom and obligation between individuals, groups, and the state play a central role in argumentation. So, it sounds kind of wordy, but the best way to think about it is just trust your gut. So, if you go into a round and the motion's something like, this house would ban abortion, you might be worried about like, maybe we shouldn't do that to people. Maybe people have a right to control their bodies and we shouldn't infringe on it. Because generally any rights round is going to be debatable. There's going to be two sides to the argument. So intuitively, you should be a little bit hesitant about the kind of proposition that the motion's putting forward. It's not the only kind of arguments you can see in the round, but it's going to be one of the major ones. So there are existence rounds, which are about what kind of rights people actually have. Does this right exist? So this house believes that internet access is a human right. This house believes that access to drinking water is a human right. Or this house would not distinguish between freedom of religion and freedom of conscience, are all rounds where they're trying to substantiate that a right exists. This is different than a balancing round, where you have multiple rights at play and they're conflicting with each other, and you have to figure out which one takes like primacy over the other. So this house would ban abortion at all stages of pregnancy, and this house would waive patent rights for AIDS drugs in Africa. In the first instance, there's like a women's reproductive rights and then a potential right to life on behalf of the fetus that are at play here, and you have to choose which one to balance. Sometimes these rights or these different rounds can blend together, but generally you're going to have a fairly good idea about what kind of round you're looking at when you see the motion. So what is a right? So a right is something that's owed to you because of some kind of conditional criteria. It's a principle of freedom of entitlement that allows you to do something or allows you to make a claim on somebody to do something for you. The burden of proof normally falls intuitively on the restriction of a right, not the exercise of it. So I don't have to prove to you that I have a right to life. I don't have to prove to you that I should be free to direct my life as I see fit. Intuitively, any restriction on my ability to live my life on my own terms is what needs to be justified, not me having to justify living life on my own terms. Does that make sense? Cool. And there's kind of an implication here to draw a nice line between rights and nice things to have. So a right is, like I said, something that you feel you should be able to make a claim on somebody to provide for you if you can't do it yourself or that somebody has to justify restricting it. A nice thing to have is just that. It's nice, but do we really think that you should deserve to have it unconditionally? So having a flat screen TV is a really nice thing to have, but if I can't provide one for myself, should I have a claim on Jessica or the state or my parents to provide one for me? So that's kind of the difference between a nice and a right thing to have, and it's important to keep that in mind when you're debating a rights round. So things not to do in a rights round. So don't be cyclical or absolutist. So you can't just get up there and just like assert that this right is important and it exists and you can never infringe on it. We infringe on the most basic rights all the time. You can't yell fire in a movie theater because like obviously there's some sort of harm incurred when you do that. So you can't just assert that your right is just the more important one and thus it can't be infringed. So you have to get a little bit more depth. So appeals to authority. So just saying like this right exists in the charter, so that's a thing, you can't do that, is not good enough. In debate, we're not having an argumentation about what exists or what smart people have said. We're smart people and we can argue about this ourselves. Another thing that came up in my debate round yesterday was we were talking about conscription, and they said it in Switzerland, and the Prime Minister said, well, why should we not have conscription? 73% of the Swiss population supports it. So appealing to kind of populism or what people believe is also an insufficient justification for a right. For the same reason that if I were to say, well, 200 years ago, we thought that black people didn't deserve the same rights as white people. So you can't appeal to that kind of historical principle because it's just false. Like people can be wrong all the time, so just because people believe something doesn't actually make it true. So those are two things to avoid in a rights round. So there are a couple different kinds of rights. So there's collective rights and individual rights. So individual rights are things that you have and exercise by yourself. By virtue of you being an individual within society, you're granted particular rights and then you can act on them yourself. So my right of freedom of speech. Because I'm an individual, I'm allowed to speak freely, and I don't have to have the justification of anybody around me to speak freely. Whereas a group right allows a group of people to have the right, and then some sort of like the group as a whole exercises that right. So it's a little bit fuzzy, but the example that I use are unions. So unions can negotiate wages on behalf of their members. Individual union members don't negotiate their wages with different firms. They have union representatives to speak on behalf of the group and negotiate rights in that way. So another distinction is between negative rights or freedoms and positive rights and obligations. So a negative right is a freedom. It's something that I am free to do and I don't need anybody to do for me. So freedom of speech is another example. I like it. I don't have to have anybody to help me speak freely. I am an able-bodied person. I can just speak, and I don't have to have any justification or help to do so. A positive right or an obligation is something that you can't just simply do by yourself, that you have a claim or an obligation out there in the world to get somebody to do something for you. So the right to a lawyer in a criminal trial if you can't afford one. You have a claim on the state to provide a lawyer for you when you can't do it yourself. That's a positive right. So is that distinction clear? Cool. And one thing to note about positive rights is it's not always individual state. Who is obliged to do something for you? Sometimes it can be the member of the group that you're a part of. Sometimes it can be your family. Sometimes it can be other just specific individuals in society. So if you want to come up in a debate round and you want to try to articulate a positive right, it's a good idea to figure out who is the person who has an obligation to help you and then substantiating why. You can't just assert that, well, you have a right to have something, but then not really justify why the person who's obliged to do something is obliged to do it in the first place. So thinking about rights. So there's a couple different ways to think about rights that I think are important. Generally speaking, having a theory or framework bolsters your case. So having this kind of abstract way of thinking about rights that informs how you want to balance rights in a particular context is important. So these are the three main kind of ways to think about rights. So there's the utilitarian or consequentialist way of thinking about rights, which is essentially that look at the consequences to determine whether or not we should allow a right to exist or we should grant a right. Nothing is valuable in and of itself. The only time that we grant rights is when we think they're conducive to positive outcomes. So we grant people the right to free speech because we think doing so creates a better world. If granting people the right to free speech does not make a better world, or in particular instances if it doesn't make a better world, then we restrict that right. So Jeremy Bentham is like a famous utilitarian. He once called rights, I think it was something like lies on stilts, in the sense that there is no such thing as rights. All that matters is making sure we have a better world. And that's kind of a really extreme utilitarian position to take, in a sense that rights are just rules of thumb that we deviate from whenever they make the world a bit better place. So that's kind of a principle about when we infringe on rights and why, and it's a way to think about rights when you get into a debate round. Do we have any questions on that kind of conception of rights? So.
How should you be cognizant of engaging like another team when they have a particular rights framework and you might have a different one? Like, do you want to generally take a different stance or fight them on their own stance? Do both? Like, talk more about that kind of thing.
Okay, so you don't always have to define your way of thinking about rights as differently. If a person gets up there and says, we think that we restrict the right to free speech because we think if we silence bigoted people in public, we get a better world. And then you can get up there and offer a response that says, no, you don't actually get a better world. By silencing these people, you actually don't allow for a discourse and you actually hold society back. So you're saying, like, no, there's a particular harm happening in this instance, but if you look at society more generally, or if you take a more long-term view, the benefits do outweigh the costs. You can also just take a different stance and come up with a different theory. You don't have to deviate from their theory to argue against them. You can work within a particular theory of rights if it's what you feel more comfortable in. But if you are going to develop a different kind of theory to attack them from, you do have to do a little bit more legwork in kind of justifying why your theory is more valuable. Does that make sense?
Yeah, because I'm just kind of wondering that in terms of, like, you know, you get some rounds where one side is utilitarian and one side is more like inherent rights. And just kind of shoot past each other and don't actually really
So it's one of the things, like when you get an instance like that, it kind of gets philosophical in a sense that you guys are attacking people's principles and underpinning logic. So something that you don't really do in a debate round. Debate round's always kind of talking about like your argument and your harms, whereas this is kind of like taking your mind frame and way of thinking about the world and showing why it's distorted. So there's not a lot of direct clash there, but it can be really substantive if you can refute somebody like that. One method for thinking about this kind of way is like refuting a person's underlying like framework is to kind of just like draw parallels where that framework should make you feel uncomfortable. So if somebody takes a utilitarian framework to justify restricting free speech, for example, they say, yep, you do a harm to a person, we should restrict it. If you want to take that, you can look at other instances where people are harmed, but we think that we shouldn't necessarily restrict that right in that instance. So an example of this could be, I don't know, like a instance like in which, I'm not sure, like an example is escaping me right now, but when you, like if you can get to a point where you can just kind of like project like an instance where like people are harmed, but we should feel uncomfortable restricting this particular right. So, for instance, like political advocacy or something like that. Maybe people door knocking and stuff like that dissuades people from being interested in politics. But if we were to restrict people's ability to just go door to door to like spread their message politically or something, we'd have a far less engaged populace. And even if like, you know, it's like less confrontational, less combative, it seems counterintuitive that we should be restricting the ability for people to go have freedom of association or something like that. So trying to draw parallels in which like if you follow their theory to its logical conclusions, you end up with an uncomfortable result. You can't just point to that uncomfortable result and say, and that's bad and you should not argue for it, but you can point to that like kind of uncomfortable result as like a case study or an instance which should make their theory sound dubious, and then argue against why your own theory allows for that kind of freedom and is intuitively the better one, and then kind of substantiating that argument. All right, so the next kind of way of thinking about rights is a sort of natural or inherent, and the best way of like phrasing this is screw the consequences. There are some things that you just can't do to people. So where a utilitarian might say it's like you can justify killing one person to save the lives of 100. A person who has a natural or inherent view of rights would say there's some things that you just can't simply do to people. That actively killing another person can never be the thing that we permit them to do, because people have rights to life and you can't infringe upon them, even if doing so saves the lives of other people. So it's kind of hard to get depth on that though. Like, why do people just have this inherent human right? Why do people just have things that we can't do to them? So one of the things is kind of these rights that are so tied up and inextricably linked to being able to live a full and fulfilling life, that without a particular right, you can't actually be a human being in any meaningful sense. If we don't grant people certain fundamental rights, whether they're political, whether they're moral, that they simply can't function as a human being in like the kind of political or moral sense of the term. It's difficult to get depth there, but when you do, it can be a very, very persuasive argument that not a lot of people can really take down if you do it right. So the third way of thinking about itself is this sort of contractual or Rawlsian way of thinking about rights. So in this sense, it's a little bit more abstract and philosophical, but it can also be quite compelling. So generally, the way of thinking about rights in this sense is you separate yourselves from your material biases. So imagine that you're a person who's constructing a society which you're going to live in. But you don't know how old you are, what ethnicity you are, what religion you are, what gender you are, what your sexual orientation is. You know nothing about yourself except that you're a person who will live in that world. You're then tasked to come up with a system of rights for that society. So the thought process here is that since you don't know what your factors will be, you'll construct a system of rights to protect the least advantaged members of society. So, for instance, you're not going to have a system of legal rights which privileges one class or one ethnicity over the other, because you know that you could end up in the ethnicity that's being oppressed, and therefore you'll try to ensure against worst possible outcomes that way. Does that kind of make sense? Any questions on that? It's a little bit more one of the more abstract ways of thinking about rights, so it can be a little fuzzy.
Let's go on everything.
Yeah. So yeah, one of the things about this one is it takes an entirely socially constructed view of rights. That rights are things that aren't out there in the world that we can discover, but they're just something that we make up. And that's one of the things that all of these theories of rights actually have in common, is that even if they pretend to think that there's an objective truth out there in the world, that people just have natural rights and you can't infringe them, it's always important to remember in a debate round that the way that we think about rights, the language that we use to discuss rights, and the principles that we use when they come into conflict with one another are always socially constructed. Our language is socially constructed, therefore our way of thinking about them is socially constructed. So you can't just be inflexible or assert that things are self-evidently true or objectively true. You always have to try to get that depth there in a debate round, because judges will not just let you assert something like that. So the last point is essentially, you'll find this out after a couple tournaments, debate lends itself to utilitarian arguments. The structure of debate in general is about weighing the harms on one side of a case versus the benefits on another, and trying to show that your side comes out ahead in a cost-benefit analysis. It's what happens in international relations rounds. It's what happens in like society and law and culture rounds, and it does happen in moral rounds once in a while. It's far easier to assert that something is beneficial than something is like objectively or philosophically true. So keep that in mind. Like the natural rights and the contractual rights can win you a debate round, but it's less common than utilitarian rights, and it's a little bit harder to get through. I highly encourage you to like try pursuing other ways of thinking about rights, because I am not a utilitarian, and I would very much love to see somebody win a rights round against a utilitarian. All right. So thinking about why we limit a right. So situational factors we might have intuitive concerns about allowing an exercise of a right in these instances. So an ability to consent is something that we think is necessary for a right. You have to be able to consent to use a right, essentially. There are a couple instances where we might limit this right, though. So for instance, if you're a child, should you be allowed to sign a legal contract? Most people would say no, because you lack some sort of cognitive function or ability. Then you have to if you're talking about that in a rights round, when somebody lacks a certain cognitive ability to function well and to make a choice on exercising a right, you have to talk about why that's important, why that's relevant. And most of that's going to be informed by that theory of rights that you kind of would have laid out earlier. So another way of thinking about what restricting rights is the harm principle. So it's essentially like we allow you to exercise a right up until the point you incur a harm on another person. There's a bit of problems here when you're talking about what a harm is. Is a harm physical? Is a harm emotional? Is a harm psychological? And then you have to do work to justify why these sort of mental, psychological harms are the ones that we should protect against, because they're much more subjective than a physical harm, for instance. Having your worldview foundationally shaken is far more subjective than whether or not your arm is broken. So that's kind of a dichotomy between physical and psychological harms that you might have to justify. So hierarchy. Are some rights just more important than others? One thing. So one of the things to talk about the harm principle is what if you harm yourself? Are you allowed to do things that harm yourself, but you reserve the right to do them? Or should the state step in to stop you from hurting yourself? Is there a situational factor such as your ability to be rational and exercise rational thought? Or do we take away that right because you're lacking some sort of cognitive ability? So that's something to bear in mind too. Are some rights more important than others? Are negative rights more important than positive rights? Or individual rights more important than collective rights? That's a way that you can sort of justify why you prefer one right over the other when you have this sort of conflict of rights in a debate round. But you can't just stop at saying we prefer one or the other. You always have to show us why. In debate, it's all about getting depth. It's all about explaining stuff to us. And that's something that you have to work through in a debate round when you're trying to say some rights are more important than others. So utility-based criteria. Essentially, do the harms outweigh the benefits? It's a big justification for redistributive taxation. We violate an individual's economic rights or property rights to hold their wealth and to hold their income, in the sense that we think that that income can be better served helping people who don't have as much money. We infringe on a right to help other people. That's the sort of criteria where you say that you can limit a right. One thing to be careful of when you're doing this, slippery slope arguments don't normally work in debate, but if a person has a very ill-defined principle when they're using utility-based criteria, you can use that against them. So, say taking $1,000 from Donald Trump to give a single parent with 3 jobs does less harm to Donald Trump than the benefit done to the single parent. A utilitarian would say, good job, go ahead, you should do that. But where do we stop? Where do we stop redistributing income from people? You have to have a principle if you want to protect yourself against the logical conclusion, which is you take money from people up until the point that the money that you're giving to other people essentially balances out. That you're taking so much money from Donald Trump that he's essentially on the same income level of the people that you're now trying to help. So having a principle to ensure against that with some sort of substantial impact done to a person. Why do we care about that, essentially? So always having a principle in a rights round is very important. Which brings me to the 3 things that you should always do in a rights round. So firstly, have a framework. Having a way that you tell the judges how you think about a round will do wonders for you. Being able to get up there and say, Mr. Speaker, I think people have rights for these reasons. We restrict these rights when these certain things happen. In 45 seconds, you've informed the judges about the way that you're going to be thinking about the round, and they'll actually be more likely to subconsciously fill in the gaps for you in your argumentation. Because when you give a theory, it gives your point of view clarity, and it makes your house stand out in the round. The next thing is principles. In a rights round, and in any debate round really, being able to point to one or two things that your side stands for in a debate round are very important. And in a rights round, they insure you against certain things, because every theory of rights has its flaws. The utilitarians have flaws about, the slippery slope and giving away money to everybody. The natural rights people have flaws about just their inflexibility, or just certain things like taxation that, we feel that are necessary to do. So having a principle gives you a well-defined, nuanced stance in a debate round that can ensure you against a lot of clash. And the third thing is clarity and consistency. So make those principles clearly. Make sure they're applied consistently when they come to different situations. If your opposition team starts lobbing counterexamples at you about where your theory fails, don't waffle. Don't throw away your theory or discard your principles to make it fit with this example. Show how your theory actually offers a good explanation to that example, because this is debate. This isn't the real world. It's not about being right or wrong, it's about winning the debate round. And you win a debate round by making sure that you stand for something clearly and you argue for it. So is there any questions? Cool. Awesome.